In the year 1499, a man walked across the Rialto Bridge carrying a bag that weighed more than his future. Inside was enough gold to buy 3 palaces on the Grand Canal. But when he arrived home that night, he discovered it was worth nothing. That man was Marco Dandolo, heir to one of Venice's most powerful banking families. And his ruin was no accident. It was the final symptom of something that had begun decades earlier, when the Venetians made the mistake that has destroyed every financial empire in history, believing their money was eternal. To understand how Venice went from being the financial center of the known world to a tourist relic, we must go back to 1453. That year, Constantinople fell into Ottoman hands. For most Europeans, it was a religious and political tragedy. For the Venetians, it was something much worse, an economic death sentence. For 3 centuries, Venice had controlled the trade routes to the east. Spices, silk, gold, and silver passed through the port of San Marco before being distributed across Europe. Venetian bankers didn't just lend money, they had invented bills of exchange, maritime insurance, and joint stock companies. They were the pioneers of what we now call global finance. But the fall of Constantinople changed the rules of the game. The Ottomans didn't completely close the trade routes, but they controlled them. Costs skyrocketed, margins shrank, and for the first time in centuries, the Venetians found themselves competing instead of dominating. This is where the story becomes familiar to anyone who has lived through a modern financial crisis. Instead of adapting, Venice doubled down on the past. Bankers kept lending as if nothing had changed. The government kept spending as if revenues were eternal. And everyone convinced themselves that what had worked for 300 years would work forever. Meanwhile, something was happening on the other side of the world that the Venetians barely noticed. In 1492, Christopher Columbus had reached America. In 1498, Vasco da Gama had rounded Africa to reach India. The trade routes that had made Venice rich for centuries suddenly had competition, and that competition was deadly. The Portuguese could bring spices from India directly to Lisbon, completely bypassing the Mediterranean. The Spanish had access to infinite quantities of American gold and silver. And the French and English were building oceanic fleets that would make Venetian galleys obsolete. The problem wasn't just geographical, it was structural. Venice had built its financial empire on the control of information. In an era when news traveled slowly, whoever knew first where there was demand for silk or shortage of pepper could make fortunes. But the new oceanic routes changed that. Information began to flow faster from more places to more destinations. By 1500, Venetian bankers faced a reality that no medieval finance manual had contemplated: global competition. They could no longer control prices simply by controlling ports. They could no longer charge monopolistic commissions for exchanging currencies. The world had become too big for a single city to dominate. Venice's response was classic and predictable. First, denial. The patricians insisted that the new routes were temporary, that oceanic costs were prohibitive, that clients would return. Second, manipulation. They tried to pressure other Italian states to boycott products arriving through non-Venetian routes. Third, desperation. They began taking financial risks they would have avoided in times of abundance. This is where Marco Dandolo enters the story. In 1499, his bank financed a massive expedition to Alexandria, betting everything that they could restore the old trade routes through pure will and capital. They bought spices at inflated prices, paid enormous bribes to Ottoman officials, and chartered the largest fleet Venice had sent east in decades. The expedition was a disaster. By the time the spices arrived in Venice, the Portuguese had already flooded European markets with cheaper, better quality products. The gold Dandolo had invested evaporated. But worse still, the failure revealed something the Venetian elite had been denying. They were no longer indispensable. The collapse wasn't immediate. Like all real financial crises, it developed slowly and then suddenly. First, small banks began to fail. Then, the more conservative trading houses restricted credit. After that, foreign investors withdrew their money. And finally, the same patrician families who had built the system began liquidating their positions. By 1510, Venice had lost more than money. It had lost its position as the center of global financial information. The new centers of power were in Lisbon, Seville, and increasingly in Antwerp. The financial innovations that had made the Venetians famous migrated north to the cities that controlled Atlantic trade. What makes the Venetian collapse fascinating is how it anticipates all modern financial collapses. The Venetians didn't fall because they were incompetent or corrupt. They fell because they built a system optimized for a world that no longer existed. Their strengths became weaknesses. Their monopoly became rigidity. Their confidence became arrogance. It's the same story we've seen repeated since then. London banks dominated the 19th century until two world wars shifted power to New York. Wall Street dominated the 20th century until globalization began distributing financial power to Asia and other continents. No financial center is eternal. They all make the same mistake, assuming that the conditions that made them successful will last forever. Marco Dandolo died ruined in 1503, but his story didn't end there. His descendants found work in the new financial centers of Northern Europe. They carried with them the techniques they had learned in Venice: double-entry bookkeeping, risk analysis, portfolio diversification. The knowledge survived, though the empire that had created it disappeared. That is perhaps the most important lesson from Venice's fall. Financial empires fall, but financial techniques migrate. Cities lose power, but capital finds new homes. Families are ruined, but markets evolve. Money has no national loyalties or historical nostalgia. It only seeks the best return under the best conditions. Today, as modern financial centers face their own challenges, blockchain technology, global regulation, competition from emerging markets, Venice's history offers a clear warning. It doesn't matter how solid a financial system appears. It doesn't matter how intelligent its architects are. It doesn't matter how deep its traditions run. When the world changes, those who don't adapt disappear. Venice's golden curse wasn't external, it was internal. It was the curse of believing that past success guarantees future results. It was the curse of confusing temporary power with eternal privilege. And it was the curse that has destroyed every financial empire in history, from Venice to, well, that remains to be seen. Because history doesn't repeat, but if you ignore it, it will crush you all the same.